Hello, Sangeeta.
Hi, Dominik. Namaste.
Namaste. Hi, Madhav. It's lovely to see you. You always look so comfortable.
We will be starting in 2 minutes. Dominik, thank you so much for being there.
Thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be here.
A very warm welcome, everyone, on behalf of NIAS ESP team. I would humbly request Professor Sangeeta Menon, who's the Dean of School of Humanities and also the head of National NIAS Consciousness Studies program, to please start with today's program. Ma'am, over to you.
Good morning and namaste to all of you. Thank you, Niharika. And it's again a great privilege for us to have Professor Dominik Wujastyk for the 9th lecture today. And I'll just make that brief statement because we have a particular way of doing things, and that I know that Preet would know what best to, how best we can do that. Over to you, Preet.
Thank you, ma'am. Namaskara. Good morning and a very warm welcome to one and all. We have a tradition of starting our sessions with an invocation. I would like to invite Dr. Pusha, who is an Ayurvedic doctor by practice. Dr. Pusha is currently a doctoral scholar with Professor Sangeeta Menon at the National Institute of Advanced Studies. She's working on, she's looking into the concept of consciousness and the self in the context of well-being in Ayurveda. I would request Dr. Pusha to start today's session with an invocation. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you, Preet, and namaste to everyone. So today I'm going to be singing a Rabindra Sangeet, which, as we all know, none of his songs are straightforward, and they have many layers of meaning. This song is in praise of the dark-hued Lord Krishna. So the song meaning goes as follows. O dark-hued, beautiful one, let your presence, imprimed with energy, rid me of heat, thirst, and hunger. The lovelorn earth gazes at the skies, awaiting you with an aching heart. In the Tamala groves and other shade-filled pathways, there is a song in the earth's heart and in her eyes as she awaits you, O dark-hued one. She weaves bakula buds into garlands in anticipation of union with you, and the air is filled with the music of the divine Basuri. Bring with you, O dark-hued one, the magic of dance, and let the world be filled with the joyous sound of bells. Shemolo Shundaro, Yesho Shemolo Shundaro, Anutapo Tapohara Trishohara Shanga Shuddhabi, Rohini Chahiya Che Akashe, Shemolo Shundaro, Yesho Shemolo Shundaro. সে যে ব্যথিত হৃদয় আছে বিছায়ে তমল কঞ্জপতে সজল ছায়াতে নয়নে জাগিছে করুণ রাগিনী শ্যামল সুন্দর এসো শ্যামল সুন্দর বকুল মুকুল রেখেছে গাথিয়া বাজিছে অঙ্গনে মিলন বাঁশুরিয়ান সাথে তোমাল মন্দির চঞ্চল নৃত্যের বাজিবে চাঁদ দেশে বাজিবে কঙ্কণ বাজিবে কিঙ্কিনি ঝঙ্কারিবে মঞ্জির রুণ রুণ শ্যামল সুন্দর এসো শ্যামল সুন্দর। Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pusha, for the beautiful invocation. Taking this forward, I would now request Professor Sangeeta Menon to introduce us to today's speaker. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Preet, and thank you so much, Dr. Pushia, for that most beautiful and most sweet music to start this lecture on Ayurveda. And always the Madhura Rasa is very important, I think, in Ayurvedic terms as well. So you really invoked that. Thank you. First, before I introduce Professor Dominik Wujastyk, I also want to thank Professor Madhav Deshpande, who helped us conceive this series, and also who introduced Professor Dominik Wujastyk to us, and which enabled us to organize his lecture today. And well, it's a real honor to have Professor Dominik, and I have the privilege to say something about his background and his work. Professor Dominik Wujastyk studied Sanskrit and Pali at Oxford under Professor Richard Gombrich and others. His Oxford DPhil was written under Professor Bimal Matilal, and he had the benefit of studying under the great Vyakarana scholars who worked in Pune at that time, including Pandit Vaman Balkrishna Bhagavat, Professor S.D. Joshi, and Professor Saroja Bhatte. He has specialized in the study of Sanskrit manuscripts in Vyakarana and in Ayurveda. He spent a major part of his career at the Wellcome Institute for the History of Medicine in London. And after some years at the University of Vienna, he is now professor and Singma Chair of Classical Indian Society and Polity at the University of Alberta in Canada. So what a proud privilege for all of us, and for me personally on my birthday, to listen to Professor Dominik Wujastyk on his lecture on Ayurveda. But I may like to request Professor Madhav Deshpande if you would like to say something in the beginning. Professor Madhav.
A hearty welcome to Dominik, who also happens to be my Guru Bandhu, because he studied with Bhagavat Shastri and Professor S.G. Joshi a few years after I left Pune, but he has been a great grammarian and sort of member of that rare club of great grammarians, and so I want to hear from him during his talk how he went from grammar to Ayurveda. And so that has been something that I have always wondered, how he made that journey. So welcome, Dominik.
Thank you.
I'd better unmute myself. Should I begin?
Yes, Professor. We have
Thank you.
also made you the co-host, so
Okay, great.
the share screen according to your convenience.
Okay, thank you. So then it should be, I should start with a little Sanskrit, and I think the best thing is the beginning of the Ashtanga Hridaya Samhita. Ragadi rogan satatanu shaktan, asheshakaya prasritan, asheshan, outsukya moharatidan jaghana, yopurva vaidyaya namostu tasmai. So that is, well, one could unpack that. Madhav, if I may answer your question, it was a hard transition from studying Vyakarana to studying Ayurveda. The way it happened is that my professor said, Dominik, I've had a letter from somebody down in London. They seem to have a library and maybe some Sanskrit materials. Why don't you go down and see what it's all about? And that was the beginning of 20 years for me working in the library in London, which was the Wellcome Library for the History of Medicine, that has a collection of about 7,000 Sanskrit manuscripts. So I became a curator of Sanskrit manuscripts, but I had been so in love with Vyakarana, and I thought that it was a serious, challenging, fascinating subject. Panini is for me like Einstein, and it's like an endless pursuit. And then I was suddenly found myself, well, I love manuscripts, and that was a wonderful journey. But I was suddenly in this institute, first of all, not amongst Indologists or even Asianists, but among historians. And they were all teaching and researching history of medicine. And at the time, I thought Ayurveda was dull, not a great thing. And I really longed to continue with Vyakarana, but I was fully employed there, which was great, had a job doing Sanskrit, even if it was not my favorite Shastra. And gradually, it took about 5 years, I began to be completely fascinated and charmed by Ayurveda, which I discovered had great depths. It's a Shastra on a level with any Shastra, and a very interesting and puzzling and satisfying subject to study. So then, that's the direction I went in. And I'm sorry to say that I'm not as sharp in Vyakarana as I used to be at all. It's a subject, you have to keep doing it. What's it? Amasa deva avayakaranaha krana deva annayayika. Okay, so it's a Nayayika saying, but I feel that certainly more than a month has passed since I had any real expertise in my fingertips. However, when you study something deeply for a number of years, it never completely leaves you. And I'm very happy that Vyakarana formed part of my training. And Madhav, I also think that we were all so lucky to be together in Pune in those years, the years you were there, a little bit later when I was there. So many clever, interesting people seemed to come together in that sort of period of 10 or 15 years around that time, the 1970s and 1980s. Maybe late 60s, 70s, 80s. That period was, I think, really something special. And those of us who chanced to fall into that place and time really were quite unexpectedly blessed and lucky to meet the people there, to learn from them, to meet each other. So yeah, I really was lucky. So now I'm going to try and share my screen with you. Let's see if I can get the machine to do what we want. Okay, here we go. Okay, and I hope that everyone can see that. Preet, can you do me a thumbs up if that's okay? Everyone can see the screen. Great. So I'll try and remember to talk to camera, but I also will have to look at my screen sometimes as well. So I'm just going to set the scene to begin with the placing my study of Ayurveda in the context of history, because I am not a physician, I'm not a healer by training. And so the way I look at Ayurveda is as a historian of science and historian of medicine. All of the traditional Asian systems of medicine have globalized since the mid-20th century. We've seen traditional TCM, traditional Chinese medicine. There are Chinese medicine herbal shops in every city in the world nowadays. We've more recently seen Ayurveda globalizing and modernizing. And of course, perhaps most famously of all, yoga, which has become an international phenomenon. Now, both China and India have got long established traditions of scholarly medicine with deep historical roots. And in this, they are amongst the few cultures. I mean, one would have to add ancient Greece and Rome, but there are not many cultures that have got this depth of historical written records and manuscripts of the history of science and medicine. In China, we have the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor, the famous Huangdi Neijing, which is an encyclopedia, if you like, of medical wisdom from probably the early centuries of the Common Era. We've in India got the compendiums of Charaka, of Sushruta, and I didn't list there, but Bhela also. And both the Chinese and the Indian corpuses are large amounts of medical literature composed by many authors over a period of time, maybe even more than 100 years. And both are datable to about 2000 years before the present. Let's not get too tangled up in details. There's more to be said about dating, but they're from the beginning of the Common Era. So scholarly medicine works with an elaborate set of theories about the natures and causes of illness and the causal relationships between disease and therapeutics. And I will come back to this question of theory because it's a very important point. Scholarly medicine requires formalized medical education, including an explicit syllabus or explicit syllabi, an explicit syllabus, and training requirements that are administered by elders or by professionals. So this is different from somebody sitting in a corner of a village and saying, you know, I've got a herb that I know works. This is a formal system involving literature and involving formal training. And scholarly medicine is transmitted forward in time in formalized ways, including manuscript copying and printing. So these are all well known to us, but it's as well to make it very clear. For example, contrast with scholarly medicine would be folk medicine, which does not have these characteristics. Finally, scholarly medicine recognizes a professional corpus of agreed authoritative medical treatises that form the basis of the knowledge system and that require mastery. So in China with the Huangdi Neijing, in India with Charaka, Sushruta, Bhela, and others, especially Ashtanga Hridaya Samhita and other texts. So we've started off saying these systems have modernized. So what do we mean by modernity? And you know, there is a library of books about modernity and what it means and what are the characteristics of modernity. But I'm going back to a famous early book on this, Anthony Giddens' Consequences of Modernity, where he identifies non-locality and globalization as one of the key features of modernization. What does this mean? It means that a tradition that might have been well established in Mumbai, say, or a smaller place, you know, Wai in Maharashtra. Maybe there was a strong Ayurvedic tradition. No, Kottakkal, that's even better. Perhaps there's a strong Ayurvedic tradition in Kottakkal in Kerala, and it's in Kottakkal. But at some point, what is happening at Kottakkal begins to happen in London and Paris and New York. And it becomes a global phenomenon. They start selling their medicines internationally. People come internationally to Kottakkal to experience what they're doing there. And what used to be a local tradition becomes global. This is one of the hallmarks of modernity, is this transition from local to global. What happens when a tradition globalizes is that it becomes disembedded. So when somebody practices Ayurveda in Kottakkal, there are a number of cultural assumptions and a whole cultural environment surrounding that clinic, that doctor, that patient, that cannot be taken for granted in New York, in London and Paris, or Nairobi. The tradition may be reproduced elsewhere to some extent. There may be a Ganesha in the corner of the clinic in New York. There may be incense burning. There may be some sitar music in the background in a clinic in Nairobi. But nevertheless, the tradition as such has been disembedded from its original setting, and that changes it irrevocably. So disembedding is another feature of modernity. Self-referentiality and reflexivity. This is one of the most interesting features of modernization. What this means is that a tradition begins to ask itself what it is. The practitioners, in our case, the Vaidyas, some of them will begin to say, well, what am I doing? And what's everybody else doing? I'm practicing the tradition that I learned from my father, my grandfather, but all these people around me got trained in college and they're doing something called allopathic medicine, maybe, or something. So what is my science in relationship to their science? Where does it fit? Where does my science come from? And so many questions of this kind begin to arise. So the tradition begins when it is modernizing and of course, modernization, I've tied it here together with globalization, but this can happen within India too. This is not just what happens in New York, but this is also what happens in Delhi, Mumbai, and Chennai, and other places. So this questioning and self-reflexivity. So, for example, a modern artist like Picasso will be experimenting with the form of what he's doing and challenging the tradition and trying to create things nobody ever did before, and saying, well, normally we draw a picture with eyes there, but what about if we do the eyes like that? Or change everything, turn it upside down, push it inside out, change the art, and think about what that means. What effect does it have on people who see it? Do I like it? Do I not like it? Is it beautiful? Is it ugly? All of this kind of reflection is very different from, say, what happened when Leonardo da Vinci painted a painting, which was where the effort was to develop absolute mastery of representational art, very fine brushstrokes, and to make the image on the canvas live, to make it as close to reality as possible, to make the viewer gasp at the reality of the reproduction. So the modern artist doesn't do that. The modern artist is challenging those assumptions. So again, we would need to think what that means in the case of Ayurveda as it modernizes, that various actors in the field of Ayurveda are doing that. They are challenging, reinventing, and rethinking what it means. And that reflexivity is one of the consequences of modernity. Finally, these networks of trust. This is a huge subject. I've spoken about it in other contexts, and we can only just gesture towards it a little bit here, but modernization involves the development of networks of trust. If you were living in the village of Kottakkal 150 years ago, you would have certain reasons to trust your Vaidya because his father knew your father, and whatever it might be, you knew that he had gone once to Paitan in the Godavari Valley and studied with a great Vaidya there and came back. Or that he had been practicing in the village at the time you were born, and you know many people in the village who were cured by him, so you have confidence. So there is a local a network of trust. Why do you trust this person? So with the disembedding and globalization and reflexivity and all of these other factors, a tradition has to develop new ways of trusting itself. So if I go to a Vaidya in Nairobi or in Cairo or in London, why do I do that? Why do I trust them? There must be some reason, and those reasons will be different networks of trust than those that were developed before the tradition was disembedded. They will be maybe to do with the publication of scientific results in double-blind, in peer-reviewed journals. Some of the things may be the same. Oh, my friend went there, she had a good time, so I'll go there. But there may be other formalities, formal ways of developing trust. One of the ones that affects Ayurveda very strongly in most countries outside, and to some extent in India, to a great extent in India too, is the development of qualifications, training, licensing. You can't just say, I'm an Ayurvedic doctor. You have to have some training in a government-approved college, and you have to pass a degree and get a license to practice, all very much modeled on the allopathic medical model. That all That all happened in the 19th century. When it's going on in London or in Paris or Nairobi, the processes are different because an Ayurvedic, so what has happened is that most nations have developed local Ayurvedic professional societies for Ayurveda that handle syllabus, training, licensing, and code of ethics. And the government says that as long as a physician has been approved of and been through the processes laid out by this professional organization, then they are able to practice. There may be some limits, perhaps no surgery or something like that, but nevertheless, within certain guidelines, they are permitted to practice. They are licensed and legal. And of course, what that also means, it has big implications for insurance as well. So the medical therapies can be paid for. So these are all processes of modernization that have affected Ayurveda very, very strongly. So part of the rhetoric surrounding Ayurveda as it has modernized is that it is good because it is old. The history of Ayurveda is routinely invoked as part of the supporting narrative for the potential of this medical system in the modern world. This, and you will hear this all the time, Ayurveda is 5,000 years old. So Ayurveda is valuable because it is old. That is one of the validating claims for Ayurveda. Now, this figure 5,000 bears no relation at all to any historical information. It is a ritual and semiotic act, not a historical one. The figure 5,000 is very much like a mantra. It is a symbolic sound, 5,000. It's people quite often, if you ask them, what do you mean 5,000 years ago, or do you mean 5,000 BC? They may not be sure. That it's not a real date. It's not the kind of 5,000 that a historian deals with. It is a symbol for age. It is a symbol for antiquity. And I just thought I would share with you, I mean, you don't have to look very far to find these things, but here is an advertisement: 5,000-year-old Ayurveda today. What is Ayurveda? Practiced in India for over 5,000 years. So we have that. Here we have the image. This doesn't actually say 5,000, but there is also the invocation of a fantasy of a past India in which smiling sages are grinding herbs on a hill, on a mountain top, with a thatched kuti in the background and a manuscript in the foreground. There's a lot of iconography here, which is, there's more that we could unpack, but again, there is without the word 5,000, there is still the invocation of a perfect past. So practitioners of modern establishment medicine, by which I mean allopathy, modern establishment medicine, they do not routinely invoke Hippocrates, Galen, or even more recent historians of writers on medicine, important writers on medicine as Osler. When you go to an allopathic doctor, he will not say, come in or advertise his clinic by saying, my practice is 5,000 years old. We would find that strange. Strategic narratives for the validation of modern medicine depend upon signs of newness and technology and professionalism. So it's still all just images and ideas, but this is the sort of thing that you'll find on websites or on photographs that are meant to symbolize modern medicine. None of this, the 5,000 year, nor the stethoscope, none of this really has anything to do with the validity or power of the medical therapies involved. This is all the world of symbols. This is another image. You can find this sort of thing all over the place, people with masks and gowns. So this is a very different image from the sage sitting on a hillside. The stethoscope, absolutely fantastic symbol. All doctors have to have a stethoscope. So modern establishment medicine radically severs its connection with ancient and medieval European medicine. The past may be invoked by way of an honor, but not as a validation of medical efficacy. So physicians may sort of smile and mention the name Hippocrates, but they won't say, this is going to work. My medicine is powerful medicine because of Hippocrates. The contemporary modern establishment medicine doctor does not invoke Galen or Hippocrates as validating causes for taking the medicines that they prescribe. Does history and tradition really matter when we are choosing a therapy? Or should we rather ask, to whom and in what social circumstances does the invocation of history evoke trust? Sorry, that should be evoke trust. Just move that over there. So I'm raising here a number of these questions, and I feel that these invocations and images and ideas about the key features of these medical systems are in fact ways of invoking trust. And I don't mean to belittle them. Trust is incredibly important. You know, you couldn't see that more vividly than in the present time when we are learning whether or not to trust this COVID vaccine. Trust is at the heart of a great big public health issue. I've heard many professional epidemiologists saying that the epidemiology has been almost miraculous. They've done amazing science in the last 12 months. But there hasn't been enough attention paid to developing trust in the worldwide population. Now, many people are on board, but an uncomfortable number of people are not. And there are many people who are worried about vaccination. So we see that these symbols by which medicine invokes trust are absolutely central and important. So different images and ideas are used to create a sense of trust between the practitioner and the patient, or the business and the consumer. The very word traditional as a qualifier of Chinese or Indian medicine invokes history as a significant positive value underlying the encounter. If you say something is traditional, you're giving it a particular kind of value. Modern establishment medicine, by and large, relies on a quite different iconography for projecting an image intended to create a sense of trust and professional expertise. So this is a little bit irrelevant, but I was just looking at symbols of modern medicine, and one finds the caduceus very often, this ancient Greek image of a staff with curled snakes around it and wings at the top. So this particular badge here is the badge of the medical corps in the United States. And I was astonished to find that this was actually introduced in about 1900. It's not old at all. The caduceus as the symbol par excellence of the history of Western medicine and the invocation of the great physicians of the past, of especially the Greek physicians, was just invented in about 1900, and it wasn't even on purpose. It was the result of a number of errors and misunderstandings. So the history of the caduceus, you should look into it. It's a very unexpected story, but yet we see this symbol everywhere in all medical establishments. So let's now turn specifically to Ayurveda and think about some of the big ideas in the tradition of Ayurveda. The Indus Valley really is, I'm just putting that there because it is one of the points at which you can begin talking about Indian history, but it tells us almost nothing about Ayurveda. The people of the Indus Valley almost certainly were not Sanskrit speaking, and now we've got new DNA evidence that makes this even more certain than ever. So I'm simply mentioning it, but really in a way to say that this isn't really very much about doesn't offer us very much for the history of Ayurveda, nor does the Vedic religion or its medicine. And this may seem a surprise. After all, the word Ayurveda has the word Veda in it, doesn't it? So, but in that compound, it really is a samasa it's like the English word ology, like geology. It's the science of Ayur. It's the science of long life. It's not really. It's not saying that this is, one of the Ayurvedic texts are part of the Vedic corpus. And if you look at the Vedic corpus, there are many of there are a number of hymns that involve healing, but none of them have used the key words or concepts from Ayurvedic theory. And Ayurvedic theory, especially Tridosha theory, really isn't there. There are some parts of later classical medicine that can be found in Ayurveda, in the Vedic hymns. And I'm thinking particularly of at the moment of Marman theory, the theory that there are sensitive points in the human body. So that word Marman or Varman is actually there in the Vedas, and it has a meaning which is probably continuous with its meaning in Ayurveda and in martial arts in Kerala. Some of the plants that are mentioned in the Vedic hymns are the same plants that are used in Ayurveda, but then they would be, wouldn't they? Because we're talking about the same geographical area. Oops, sorry, I've gone back. Buddhist medicine. Now here, for the first time, we get a lot of material that is recognizable from someone who knows about Ayurveda. In fact, in the whole of Indian literature, it's in the Pali Tripitaka that we get the first mention of the theory of doshas. That there are Vayu Pitta Kapha, and there may be something called Sannipatika, which is when all three of the doshas are too much or too little. And this is it's really in the early Buddhist literature that we find our first glimpses of therapies that then appear in a very similar way in Ayurvedic recipes and so on. So there is a real continuity with I would say, it's not Buddhism so much as the culture of Magadha, the culture of what is today Bihar and northeast, that northern eastern part of India. So there are also quite other forms of medicine in India. We have Siddha medicine, Unani, local health traditions, religious healing, shamanism, and tantric healing and snakebite. So one of my colleagues, Michael Sluba, has been doing important and original work, finding that there are really quite different ideas in tantric healing. Especially connected with Garuda, who is the arch enemy of snakes. So what is this literature? Because I said at the beginning that one of the hallmarks of a scholarly tradition is the transmission of a formal literature. So we first have the Charaka Samhita, which is a great treatise on Ayurveda, and here is, I don't know if you can see with this small window, but I mustn't unplug myself. But here is my copy of Charaka. It's a big book, and here is my copy of Sushruta. So this is the oops, I'm changing the screen. So that's the second great compendium. It's a large treatise. And it takes a long time to think about it, read it, digest it. And I'm still, like, after many years, I'm still very much a beginner. Vagbhata's Heart of Medicine became the textbook in India for doctors. Although Charaka and Sushruta are very important as foundational texts, they broadly were not what people used on an everyday basis. If you count the number of manuscripts in the libraries across India, some of the great libraries in Ahmedabad, in Jaipur, in Pune, of course, Mumbai, Tanjavur, Madras, Chennai, some of these libraries, you'll find dozens and dozens, scores and scores and scores of copies of the Heart of Medicine by Vagbhata, which was composed in Sindh, in what is modern Pakistan, probably around 700 AD. And then there are three more texts, the Madhavanidana, the Shangadhara Samhita, and the Bhava Prakasha, which were all also had their own life and importance. Sometime in the 19th century, I still haven't tracked this down. If anybody can find this for me, I'd love someone to find this out. Somebody decided to call the first three works here the Great Triad, and the second three the Lesser Triad, the Brihat Trayi and the Laghu Trayi. And I don't know who invented that. It's not there in the tradition itself. If you look at these works or later works, they never use that expression. It first appears sometime, I don't know, even maybe it's in English books, maybe not even in Sanskrit books. I don't know where it came from, but it's not ancient as a classification. So what do we find in these treatises? Well, we find that they teach that there are three things in the body that regulate the functioning of the body: Vayu or Vata, Pitta, and Kapha or Shleshman. Oh, sorry, I've done Kapha twice. So there is quite a lot of debate about how to translate these into English. And I always just call them humors, because in Greek medicine and in medieval European medicine, people spoke in almost the identical way. They said that they were humors, and most of them were the same, bile and phlegm. And in the European case, there was a second kind of bile, kind of black bile. So they distinguished black and yellow bile. And in the European system, there was blood, which is also there in Sushruta. Sushruta, in some passages, treats blood as a fourth humor. In other passages, he does not. So that comes and goes. So it's the same kind of concept, and the way that it's spoken about in ancient and medieval European medicine is very much the same. And so I use the word humor, but a lot of practitioners of modern and globalized Ayurveda don't like that, because I think the reason is that it makes Ayurveda sound archaic. It makes it sound old-fashioned. And a lot of modern practitioners are really invested in trying to present Ayurveda as something completely modern, and maybe as a science that already had modern wisdom already in ancient times. And then using the word humor associates Ayurveda with antiquity and with old-fashioned things, so that it's not popular. So for over 100 years, there have been Vaidyas writing that no, Vayu, Pitta, Kapha, these are not humors. They are maybe to be equated with some chemical substances and so on. But if you read the treatises, if you read Vagbhata, if you read Charaka, they say, that they have a certain taste, a certain smell, they're sticky or slimy, or they're physical substances. They're very obviously real things in the human body. So there are these three humors have a big part to play in digestion, and there is a cycle, a metabolic cycle that starts usually with the digested food, and moves the substance that you eat gets changed into chyle, which is a sort of digested juice, Sanskrit rasa, and that gets transferred through these six remaining elements: blood, flesh, fat, bone, marrow, and ends up as semen, or in women as breast milk. There's some things to talk about there, but we'll move on. And there are waste products, and there are various kinds of pipes and tubes, which in Ayurvedic texts function sometimes as carriers of blood, sometimes as carriers of manas. So it is an early conception of a nervous system. And then there are all the various organs, the stomach, the kidneys, the spleen that we're familiar with. One thing to note is that Ayurveda, classical Ayurvedic literature does not seem to recognize the brain as an independent organ, and it doesn't seem, or at least it doesn't connect it with consciousness. Consciousness resides in the heart, not in the brain. The brain is a sort of fatty tissue, but it's not really connected with cognition and with identity. And the lungs as well, surprisingly, given that there's so much talk in the Indian tradition about prana, if you read the texts carefully, the breath is going in and out of the trunk of the body. There isn't a concept of respiration connected with particular organs called the lungs. So the Ayurvedic system is divided, like any professional system, into specialities. A very important subject is the division of all food substances according to 6 categories of taste: sweet, sour, salt, bitter, pungent, and astringent. 2 potencies, hot and cold, and 20 qualities like smooth and rough, dry and wet, oily and not oily, and so forth. These are not sattva, rajas, tamas. And there is also a deep and quite elaborate theory about diseases. Diseases may be ultimately caused by sins against wisdom, which lead to inappropriate action. I should have had those 2 the other way around. And diseases may be internal or external. You may be something wrong with the doshas, the humours. You may be ill mentally. And some diseases are distinguished as being incurable. Others are curable. Others can be, you can have palliative care only. And the patient is, there are descriptions of how to, and debates, in fact, also about what is the most appropriate way to examine the patient. This threesome of observation, palpation, interrogation became popular because of, because it rhymes. So it's in a darshana, sparsha, darshana, sparshana, and prashna just sounds easy. Charaka has a different idea that one should use all the senses and so on. And there are also ecological factors, places and times and seasons. One should eat different foods in summer and winter. One should wear different clothes. One should behave differently, take different kinds of exercise at different seasonal periods. So I don't want to spend too much. There's an infinite amount of detail in this system, but I wanted to, I was listening to a lecture by Tim Maudlin, who's a philosopher of science, just recently, and it struck me, he put it very well. And this is a point I want to make about Ayurveda. He said that there is a difference between what he called a formalism and a theory. So a formalism is like a recipe. It enables us to calculate a result. And he was talking about quantum mechanics. He was saying, using Schrödinger's wave equation, you can calculate if a particle is going at this speed and at this direction at a certain point in time, then at a later point in time, it'll be somewhere else going at another speed. And you can do all that calculation, but it doesn't give you a model. It doesn't give you an ontology. It doesn't give you a theory of what's happening, which is why physicists from the beginning of the 20th century have been struggling with how to visualize quantum mechanics, because it doesn't give you a picture of the world. It gives you some formulae which you can use to calculate things, but it doesn't give you a way of thinking what it all looks like. And I gave some examples. Bohr's talk about interpretations of quantum mechanics, the pilot wave theory by de Broglie, and non-locality and so on by Bell. So different people have struggled to say, what does quantum mechanics teach us about the real world that we live in? And there's no agreement really about that. So how do we apply this to Ayurveda? Well, a theory gives us an ontological reality to imagine, as well as a predictive scheme. And this is what Ayurveda does. It's got this theory, especially the theory of the doshas, but there are other parts to this theory. The Tridosha theory is just a very good, obvious example. And there's a very interesting statement in chapter 15 of the Sutrasthana of Sushruta, where the author says, of course, you can't actually see the doshas, but from the behavior and the appearance of the patient, you can infer what is happening, that there is maybe too much of one and too little of another. So the inner state of the patient has to be understood by a process of inference. In other words, there is a model, there is an ontological statement about what is happening in the body, maybe invisible, but it's there, and a predictive system. So Ayurveda provides, I would say in a formal sense, a theory of the body and of disease and health. So also I would add to this, this was my own thought, in addition to what Tim said, Tim Maudlin, that theory enables us to explain complexity in terms of a simpler set of ideas. Because if you think about the human body and disease, it's endless. There's so much detail, there's so many possibilities. This is something Charaka says at one point, that there are so many possibilities that you can't be absolutely sure about anything, about the effectiveness of any particular medicine. But nevertheless, having a theory gives us a way of grasping this complexity. And Ayurveda precisely offers us a theory of the human body, of illness and of health. So I have a few remarks here just about modernization and globalization. I think probably most of you know that P.S. Varya founded the Arya Vaidya Shala in Kerala in 1901, Dabur in 1884 in Bengal, and started selling Ayurveda in 1901, the foundation of the All India Ayurvedic Congress in the early 20th century. Gandhi, whom I mention here, mainly because most people, at least outside India, think that Gandhi must have, it's part of the image of India that he must have been very much in favor of Ayurveda, and he really wasn't. He was not in favor of Ayurveda at all. He very much wanted to find out his own way, which was a kind of naturopathy, but something that he invented for himself. As in so many things, he wanted to go on his own path. And then after independence, we get the development after and before, but around the time of independence, we get various government commissions at the state level and at the apex level to try and decide how to handle medicine in India. And we get a hybrid system in which is what we have today with Ayush, the new Ministry of Ayurveda, Yoga, Unani, Siddha, and Homeopathy. So I would like now to turn in a slightly different direction and talk. This is a series, after all, about the Sanskrit language and its traditions. And I haven't talked very much about Sanskrit yet. So I would like to introduce you to a project that I'm running at the moment here at the University of Alberta, where we are really, really digging into the language. So this is a project called the Sushruta project, and it arises, can I make that full screen? It arises out of the discovery in 2007 of a 9th century manuscript of the Sushruta Samhita in Nepal, in Kathmandu, in a library called the Kesar Library in Kathmandu. And this was published in an international newsletter, and the world became aware of this manuscript. Since then, it has it's become registered with the United Nations, with UNESCO, as part of the Memory of the World project, the Memory of the World Heritage. And I can show you a leaf of it, I think. Oh, wait, I should get this away from being full screen. And this is what the manuscript looks like. So it's a very beautifully written thing. It's dates from the 9th century. Unfortunately, it's a little bit damaged in places, but a lot of it is, and quite a few folios are missing. So we have about something like half the work, maybe 2/3 or maybe a little less than that. So here, for example, aksharas are missing at the end of the leaf. But this manuscript, which is in Kathmandu, gives us the opportunity now to see what people thought the Sushruta Samhita was 1,000 years ago. Earlier on, I held up a copy of the Sushruta Samhita. What is this? What is this actually? So this is an edition, a printed edition of the Sushruta Samhita that was produced in 1938 by a very great Vaidya, a great Pandit, a scholar called Vaidya Acharya, Yadava Sharman Trivikrama Atmaja Acharya. And he's a very remarkable man who edited and published with the Nirnaya Sagar Press and other presses, and was himself an extraordinary scholar. And he was actually also chairman or director, president of the All India Ayurvedic Congress for several periods of time. So he was a leading figure in the first half, the end of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. And his edition, together with the commentary, is absolutely admirable. This is the third edition. The first was 1915, then the second 1931, and this last one was 1938. When he published his first edition, he looked at 3 manuscripts. And on the basis of 3 manuscripts, which were partly owned by, one was in a library and 2 of them are owned, I think, by friends of his. Yep. He printed the book. For the second edition, 16 years later, he looked at another 9 manuscripts. And finally, for this edition, he looked at another 3 manuscripts again. So we've got 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So this is based on examining 15 manuscripts. And if you start reading it, you realize very quickly it's full of difficulties. Much more than Charaka. I would say that it's really difficult and you keep thinking there's something wrong here. And when you read the commentator, Darlhana, again, who is edited from a very small number of manuscripts, he doesn't really say even about that. Darlhana, who is writing in about 1200 AD, keeps saying, oh, but other manuscripts have different readings at this point. So we keep being told by the tradition that there's something wrong with the text, that it's not in good shape. And this is reinforced when we find that there is a medieval work from the 9th century, 10th century, I think, by the author Tisaka, no, it's Tisaka's son, wrote a work called the Sushrutapata Shuddhi. So it's basically a critical notes on the text of the Sushruta. So even at that time, 1,000 years ago, there was already some sense that this text needed help. So finding this ancient palm leaf manuscript in Kathmandu, together with 2 or 3 others that are connected with it, that seem to be copies of it. This is one. And this is a third one. These are later, but still very important and somehow other connected. All these 3 manuscripts are presenting basically the same version of the text. Finding these manuscripts has given us for the first time the chance to, the chance to go back in time and see what were people reading at this time. And the answer is they were reading something quite a lot simpler. The old Sushruta that you can recover from Kathmandu is quite substantially a different text. It's in the details, but the details really add up. And I wanted to share with you what we are actually doing. So this is the live website, and as you saw on the slide, it's sushrutaproject.org, so you can find it easily. And if you go to this link, you can find your way to this project called Saktumiva, which is some technology written by a very able scholar of Sanskrit called Charles Lee, who wrote this system in order to do his own PhD, but then he has made it available free of charge to everybody. So let's go to his software, and here we now have the working edition of the Sushruta Samhita. Now, for those of you who have never been involved in editing, you may not realize how very strange this is, but the historical way that people studied texts was that they would gather all the manuscript and spend 20 years editing it and then publish a book. But for those 20 years, nobody saw anything. The whole project was private. And nobody saw anything. There would be rumors. Oh, did you know Patrick Olivelle is editing? He's editing Manu. Oh, I can't wait for that to come out. And then after some, well, it's Patrick, so it came out very quickly. But you would have to wait for many, many years to see the results of a project. With this new technology, we are here today with the web, with Web 2.0, whatever you like. We're doing this in a way that completely takes advantage of modern technology. And what it means is that we can see the results of the process of editing on the day that the people do it. So, for example, here is well, let's turn it round a little bit. Let me take the witness of Kathmandu, this manuscript we were looking at earlier. So not this one, but this one. So a transcription of part of this. It's this: Om Namah Kamalahastaya Atato Vedotpattim Adhyayam Vyakyasyama. Now, if I hover over here, I see that there's been an inserted substitution. So what we've done is to type out the beginning. We have still just beginning this process, but we're typing out what the manuscript says. Now, I know that for many people in India, it's not very comfortable to read Roman script. So over here, we can turn it all into Devanagari, which is very much more accessible. Atato vedotpattim adhyayam vyakyasyamaha. Atha kalu bhagavantam, and so on and so on. So that's one thing. And if you're in Kerala, you can have it all in Malayalam script. As you like. So it's very nice. I know there are quite a lot of computer systems around today that do this kind of font switching, but this is particularly nice. One of the things that Charles has added to the system just recently is a Newar script, a Nepala Akshara script, which I think is very appropriate. And since this manuscript was preserved in Nepal, then I think it's very appropriate that this work should be available in the Nepala Akshara. And so that will be more accessible and more interesting for historians and other readers in Nepal. If you so we can work in Devanagari, that might be easier. But this is just the beginning of the process. Let's say that I would like to see what is the comparison between this old manuscript and this printed edition of 1938. So I said the other witness, this edition has been typed by a couple of very diligent scholars in Japan. So we have that text. The system now in real time collates the Nepalese manuscript with the printed edition. A here stands for Acharya. So here we can select a word, Kashi Rajam, and we can see that there are no variations. Divodasam, no variations. But here, where this has Bhagavantam and so Amaravaram Rishigana Parivrittam Ashramastha, The printed edition has just Ashramastham. So it has got this other material, but in a different form. So suddenly we're beginning to see that there are differences, and by highlighting different parts of the text, we can examine these in detail. Now, this is, I understand this is very specialized, but for somebody who is thinking seriously about different manuscripts and comparing them with each other and trying to find out what is right and what is wrong, Anvaya Vyatireka, this is magic. It's a wonderful system. What the starting point is that you type in the manuscripts. You have to type everything into the computer, but just as it is, with all the errors, with everything as accurately as you can, just what you see on the folio. But once you've done that, then you are in a position to use this incredibly powerful system. So, for example, we are gradually evolving our own edition. This is what you saw first of all. Maybe now we'll just stay in Roman script. But if I select, for example, all of the Nepalese manuscripts and say, generate the apparatus, it collates them all in real time and gives me a critical apparatus over here. So now I can see all of the differences between, that manuscript K is missing a visarga. I mean, the level of detail of what you can do here is extraordinary. And if you want, you can have all the differences printed in this format, one above another, so it becomes very clear to see who has got what. And I think one of the most interesting things I can show you today is, let's take the old manuscript, this KL 699, this is the 1,000-year-old Sushruta, and let me compare it directly with the printed edition. So here you see on the right all the ways in which the printed edition is different from the 9th century Nepalese manuscript. And as you see, you may think that it's not very much, but on every sentence, there are 5 or 6 differences. And sometimes the differences are very important. Here, for example, we've got a whole passage that has been added to the printed text that simply is missing. It's not there in the old version of Sushruta. And this actually we're finding quite commonly. Here's another passage, a whole sentence. We're also finding that there are, let me give you one example, which I hope I can show clearly. Let me try to do this a different way. This is our edition, and I'm going to select all of the manuscripts and the printed edition to compare with it. The beginning of the Sushruta Samhita is, we shall describe the chapter about the origin of this science. Atato vedotpattimadhyayam vyakyasyamaha. And in the Nepalese tradition, it then says, Ata kalu bhagavantam amaravaram rishigana parivrittam ashramastam kashirajam divodasam aupadhena vavaitarana rabra pushkalavata karavira gopura rakshita bhoja sushruta prabhritayaha uchuhu. So all of these different sages asked or spoke to the king of Kashi, Divodasa, who was in his ashrama, surrounded by wise men. He was the best of the immortals, the Lord. So this is how the work begins in Nepal. But in the printed edition, it says, Yathovacha Bhagavan Dhanvantari. So if you remember, I was saying that A is the printed edition, and A adds this sentence, Yathovacha Bhagavan Dhanvantari. That is not present not in one of the Nepalese manuscripts. What does this mean? In the printed edition, this sentence, as Lord Dhanvantari said, is at the beginning of every single one of the chapters in the work, which is 180 chapters. every single one says, Ata ato something or other vyakyasyama yato vacha bhagavan Dhanvantari. So in the printed edition from the 20th century, Dhanvantari is the person who is delivering the science of Ayurveda. But if you wind the clock back 1,000 years to Sushruta Samhita in the 10th century, in the 9th century, there is no Dhanvantari in the picture. It simply begins, we shall now explain this science, and then it says the story of the origin of Ayurveda, that there are these sages and they ask the king of Kashi, please tell us, what is medicine and what should we do? And it is not a science that is delivered by Dhanvantari. Sometime between the writing of these Nepalese manuscripts and the later manuscripts that are used for the printing in the 20th century, 19th and 20th century, somebody changed the text. They altered the text and they put in a completely new frame in every chapter, that every chapter is delivered by Lord Dhanvantari. Now, it's not a bad thing. Lord Dhanvantari is wonderful, but it's a change. And, it's useful for a historian to know that Dhanvantari is inserted into the tradition sometime after the Nepalese manuscripts, but before the manuscripts that these 20th century editors used. Now, I said that Yadava Sharman used 15 manuscripts for his printed edition. There are probably about 250 manuscripts. I think I've so far identified about 230 manuscripts of the Sushruta Samhita, or of various parts of it. It's very unusual to find a complete manuscript, but if you take, what's that? That's so that 15 as a percentage of what's there is maybe like 7 or 8%. So the printed editions of the 20th century are based on a sample of 7% of the evidence. And of course, in our project, we cannot look at those 200 manuscripts. That would, even with the modern technology, it would be a very big job. It can be done now, but it would take a lot of funding, and it's worth doing. But that's not what we're doing. We're just looking at the Nepalese evidence. But it raises the question, what is in all these other manuscripts? So it's a strange thing, Ayurveda. We have wonderful evidence about healing and health and how people thought about disease and illness and wellness over the last 2,000 years and more. The way it has been transmitted and understood in the 20th century, just on the eve of this globalization, is very imperfect. And it takes this kind of textual work to reconstruct the tradition and to find again the pure Shuddha version of the ancient language of Sanskrit in which these great traditions were preserved. So I think I'll stop there, and I hope that raises some questions from you.
Oh, thank you so much, sir, for an exhaustive lecture. It is really interesting to listen to the history of medicine through you, drawing excerpts from across the world. You spoke about Greek, Tibetan, and also Western medicine, along with pictures for us to relate, and traditions in India, and how the evolution of Ayurveda from Indus Valley to the Vedic traditions and the Buddhist traditions, and also talking about the Brihatraya and the Laghutraya, and especially introducing us to the exhaustive work you've been doing on and the Nepalese manuscripts. With this, I would first request Dr. Pushya, who's also an
Oh yes, who sang so beautifully.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dominik. And thank you so much for such a wonderful lecture. I mean, as a student of Ayurveda, somehow, we get stuck with studying the text that we have, along with, some kind of English translations. And of course, we do study this beautiful Y.T. Acharya commentary and version that you mentioned as well. But I mean, the the perspective that, just the Nepali manuscripts provide, that what we study today is, I mean, like you say, 7% of
Yes.
at best, of
Yes.
what there was. I mean, that is really quite incredibly fascinating for me. And just two things, Dr. Dominik, that I found very interesting, and I will ask a question, if I may, about
Of
that.
course. I am
So
terrified now, but
no, no,
you're a real Vaidya. but I'll do my best. Yes.
So one of the questions that, I mean, you made a very interesting point about one, globalizing. I mean, on the brink of globalization, which requires a lot of, standardization and, understanding how,
Yes.
yeah, standardizing of medicine, standardizing of procedures, and like you said, this whole exercise of trust generation,
Yes.
right? For which maybe perhaps only this resorting to a 5,000-year-old tradition might be insufficient, right? And then we also,
Yes.
and then, to counterpose that with what you said about, I mean, the Charaka saying that actually, and in real life, what you said about quantum medicine as well, that it's very difficult to really predict how things act. And that, I mean, that is perhaps the most scientific thing that one could say about
Yes.
human
Yes.
well-being. So how would those stand with each other?
Well, first of all, different communities respond to different mechanisms of trust. So, and this is a difficult thing, but the way that Ayurveda would be presented, in Chennai, needs to be different. It needs to speak a different language and make a different appeal to people than what is done in London or Paris or Edmonton, where I live. You're right. That if we want medicine to work, then people have to trust it. And the way that we develop that trust, we have to be sensitive, because different people respond in different ways. And if you go to Paris and you say, my medicine works because my uncle was a great Vaidya, people will just look at you blankly. But if you say that in a village in the Godavari Delta, that means everything. If that uncle was a well-known Vaidya, then the tradition is there and it's very important. And so who cares about a double-blind clinical trial? That doesn't matter. I knew your great-great-grandfather. That's more important. So every situation requires adaptation. About the clinical trials, I mean, the language of the double-blind trial, the so-called gold standard of modern medicine, this is the language and this is the appeal that is made. This is the kind of thing that people in modern industrialized societies have been taught to respond to as a mechanism of trust. It's very imperfect. If you really look at the whole sort of industry of clinical testing and trials, obviously there's a great deal of good in it, but it's also not as perfect as it pretends to be. So that can be a problem. Another area that is, I think, very interesting is placebo medicine. And some people have started to write about, well, it's actually for some time, people have been writing about placebo medicine, but this is very connected with the idea of trust, that people get ill and people get better for many reasons. And you can give people in Italy a red pill for their headache. It does no good. Give them a blue pill for their headache. It works. The headache goes. And both pills are just chalk. So there's all sorts of funny things. Human beings are very complex, and the way we respond to things is difficult and complex. So it's not just science. It's a whole way of human beings relating to each other and convincing each other about certain realities. My dear friend and colleague Ram Manohar is a Vaidya who has worked a lot. He's quite well known, so you must be hearing. So he did a very interesting trial in Coimbatore that was a partnership with National Institutes of Medicine in the United States of Ayurvedic therapies, yes, for rheumatoid arthritis and so on. And this was very successful, both for two reasons, both as an example, as a very good example of how to do good science on clinical trials for Ayurveda, but also as an example of an Ayurvedic therapy that is objectively very, very effective. So everybody felt that this was an excellent model for how to proceed. And for anybody thinking about how to test, how to do clinical trials, or how to develop, ways of evaluating Ayurvedic therapies, I would always point to that classic study. It was a very good example of. I remember going to Coimbatore and talking with Ram, and he was showing me some big machine that they just bought, and he said he was so it could do assays and things, but he said he was very pleased with his machine. But he said the central problem was how to fool the patients when they were being given a placebo. He said it's very difficult to do an oil massage, a pichial massage or something like that, which isn't a pichial massage. How do you do the control group? So he did work out things. He worked out how to make medicines that were not the Ayurvedic formulation but looked and smelt like it, and things like that. It's a very sophisticated study. So I think that's an example for all of us. It was a very good bit of science.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pushya, and thank you, Dominik, sir. Now I would request Sangeeta ma'am for comments. And ma'am had a question too. Ma'am, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. In fact, mine is not a question, but mine is a word of awe after listening to Professor Dominik. Because I mean, some of us who work on health traditions, particularly indigenous medicine, one of the challenge which I and other colleagues have found is that we have too much richness, but then we don't know how to combine that or how to bring that into an organic whole where there is an exercise of logic, analysis, and a categorization of concepts. So, the couple of ideas which I think Professor Dominik brought in would definitely help me in some of the works which I am doing, and I'm sure some of the students who are working, which is when he said that how much important a theory is. For example, how do we understand body in Ayurveda? So unless we have that approach, not just only that overwhelmed by the richness of Ayurveda or any other such indigenous medicine, but how hard can we try to theorize it or bring to perhaps a possibility of some tangibility? We may miss a few things, but it's still, I think it is okay. So I'm just in awe after listening to Professor Dominik, in where he said how theory gives us an ontological reality to imagine and predictive the scheme, and how theory enables us to explain complexity in terms of a simpler set of ideas. And also, I think I'm very overwhelmed by, in one of the earlier discussion which he did in the presentation, in the context of the classic statement of Anthony Giddens, and how Professor Dominik interpreted also that what constitutes modernity. And I think this is very, very important. So when we talk about Ayurveda or such medicine, I think we have talked a lot, and people are doing a lot, and you can see the questions. We ask the same question most of the time. So, but I think it's extremely important to put Ayurveda or place Ayurveda in a bit of a historical approach or vantage point of view, where some of the concepts which would emerge will be extremely exciting. For example, I think how Professor Dominik talked about trust, and how he talked about. I mean, I'm so glad that word came, disembedding and non-locality. And also bringing in an element of cognitive capacity itself as reflexivity. The whole idea of rethinking in terms of perhaps a larger context. So I think some of these ideas which Professor Dominik has brought in are extremely important for all students who work on health traditions, particularly who get some of us who get very excited about the richness, I think we need to stay calm. We need to take our chairs and look at a way of theorizing. Because if we don't theorize, number one, we don't understand what's going on. And number two, we will not be able to present a tangible set of categories to a larger audience who may not be as well read as you are. I mean, that's just a comment, and just to thank Professor Dominik for that wonderful, insightful analysis which he presented. Over to you, Preet.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much.
Beautiful comments and reflections. Yeah, I see Ushma ji with her hands up. It'd be really nice if you could also introduce so that the speaker knows from what background you're coming.
I think before that, I think Pandit Shrikant has been raised his hand. Before that,
yeah, ma'am. I think he does not have his audio on, ma'am. I could definitely request.
Okay. Because he raised his hand even before the lecture concluded.
No, I think he raised his hand during the Brihatrai and Lagutrai. I think sir wanted to know who.
Oh, yes.
I saw his hand come up then. I would, anyway, if he's around, I would request sir to. I don't see an option of unmuting at all. So I think his audio isn't on. Anyway, I think that is being conveyed to Pandit Shrikant ji if he's around. And I think by then we could also take in, if sir is around, we'll take in the question after Ushma ji.
And maybe what we can do is, Preet, I see a lot of questions and comments, and my chat box says the number 24. So perhaps we can collect all the questions, and I'm sure Professor Dominik can reply at a later stage, or we can just listen to these questions, because anyway, we are curating these questions and sharing with all the speakers. So let's not expect the answers to all the questions, but let us give an opportunity to the speaker to listen to these questions and for us to perhaps express our questions. So may I request that your questions be in the form of a reflection and also perhaps very brief, and please let us not perhaps hurry for a reply immediately. So we'll take a lot set of questions, Preet, if that is okay. And
sure, ma'am. Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good morning, Professor Wujastyk. I've written to you before about the Sanskrit exhibition, and
Yes.
Personally, I have one is a reflection, and the second is a sort of a question. So the first thing is I'm going to just talk about the reflection on trust. Being in London, and I had a terrible illness, and I took the Ayurvedic route. So I interviewed 3 Ayurvedic physicians. I interviewed them because I just wanted to know how, and so the one I chose was based exactly on what you said was the trust. Because of she asked me, are you willing to give up 28 days, 3 weeks of your life? I wanted to judge as to how committed I was as a patient, and that's why.
Yes.
And it was, she worked fantastically for me. So this is the trust with my husband, who's English. He would have never, gone down that route. He would have he wanted to know, what are the degrees she's got, and how is it?
Yes.
It was a very, very different approach, and I chose her on that approach. My second thing was to do with the theory bit. When I started as a student of philosophy and Sanskrit in London, I had a wonderful teacher, Dr. Shastri. And when I told him, I approached him that I wanted to, do more intellectual studies, he said, Ushma, I will not teach you until you start with Tarka Shastra by Annam Bhatta. And that Tarka Shastra actually then opened up not only the darshanas, but it also gave a lot of meaning to Ayurveda. So when you're talking expansion, contraction, you're talking of the color, the rupa, rasa, gandha, and all that. So Tarka Shastra, I thought, was actually the basis from which you can build up. And he was completely spot on. He refused to teach me till I had done that course. So a lot of students who are listening, I think that's a very, very good place to start. It just gives you a basic map of how everything works within the Indian system. That's all I've got to say.
That's a very, very valuable insight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ushmaji. Once again, we request you to be brief, and because let us give voice for many others, and of course, your personal experiences, you can directly write to him, but let's have more general notions and ideas which you have. Sorry, great.
Yeah, yes, ma'am. We have Srinatha ji. It's over to you, Srinatha.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Dominik. Excellent talk.
Hello.
I'm a student of Sanskrit at Oxford. And yeah, my question was more generally on how you imagine the interaction between pre-modern medicine, be it Ayurveda or Galenic medicine in the West and so on, and modern medicine. So obviously, in terms of the physiological knowledge that ancient people had, it was much less than in modern times. And their theories were also different. They had the humors in Galenic medicine or doshas in Ayurveda. But on the other hand, they were treating people for thousands of years. And it's obvious that the treatments worked. Otherwise, people would be.
Oh,
So
it's coming and going.
Yeah, well, I think we
but
will
nonetheless,
more questions and all the
seems
questions
to work in many cases.
So
yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry. I think there has been network issues from Srinatha ji's side.
We can go to the next
Srinatha,
Yeah,
I mean, I would like to address.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know if it's exactly Srinatha's question, but he mentioned something about the Greek tradition and the Indian tradition. I don't think it's quite what he was asking, but it is a question that comes up a lot. You know, 100 years ago, there were some rather aggressive colonial authors who would say, that everything in India came from the Greeks, and all of this medical tradition of Ayurveda is just coming from Greece. It's a translation of Hippocrates into and then, of course, Indian nationalists would like to say that Ayurveda was the origin of all the Greek medicine. So everybody wants their own tradition to be the origin. But the fact is that in medical science, when you read Hippocrates and you read the Ayurvedic classics, you can tell that there's something in common. That there's passages here and there. There's a description of surgery for perineal lithotomy. It's very close, and you keep coming across other things that seem to be very, very similar. But there is no smoking gun. There are no Greek words in Sanskrit in the medical treatises. There are no Sanskrit words in the Greek treatises. The Greek authors don't say, we got this wisdom from India. They do say we got this wisdom sometimes from Egypt, but not from India. When you get to Dioscorides, whose Herbal was written around the time of Christ, was it 100 BC, I think, that does have Indian plants in it. And he says these are plants from India, but it's the theory, Ayurvedic theory is not there. So at the moment, serious historians of ancient medicine, the position is that these are two independent traditions. They may have some shared heritage from Indo-European culture. In fact, they almost certainly do. But in terms of cross-pollination, we cannot prove anything in one direction or another. They seem to have evolved really quite independently. And one can make a contrast with Jyotish Shastra, because in Jyotish Shastra, we have works like the Yavana Jataka, the work on horoscopes from the Greeks. It's known to be a translation from a Greek original text. And Jyotisha language is full of Greek words, including words that come down into Hindi, like Kendra, and Jamita for the diameter of a circle, and all sorts of Greek words in Jyotish Shastra. So in Jyotish Shastra, we do see how ancient European culture affected Indian science. But in medicine, we don't see that.
Oh, thank you, sir. I would request Girija ma'am. I'm unmuting you, ma'am. Ma'am had a question. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to ask the question. So there are hundreds of interpretations of Surya Samhita, Charaka Samhita, and Ashtanga Hridayam. So I was wondering whether the practitioners or scholars incorporated and interpreted the text with their own experience and knowledge, So is it possible to imagine a pure original Samhidas in that way as a source of the classical Ayurveda? Many texts are interpreted in and translated in different vernacular languages, incorporating the specificities of the herbs and the treatment, I mean the local health tradition. The practitioners sometimes also call the local health traditions as Ayurvedas. They claim that they are Ayurveda practitioners. So I was wondering whether there is an imagination of the evolutionary theory in this idea of an original pure text, classical text on Ayurveda. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. That's a very good and it's a difficult question to answer without hurting people because I don't want to take away anybody's faith or to challenge the idea that there may have been a perfect past where things were better than they are now. In fact, this is what the Ayurvedic treatises say. You know, they are working within the framework of the yugas, and that there was a Satya Yuga where people lived for 100 years and nobody was sick, and it was wonderful. And then because of people being greedy, it's an interesting story, actually. It's in Charaka. The reason that people begin to have too many things, and then they begin to eat too much, and they become corpulent and heavy, and they have too many possessions, and things get worse from there, and they begin to get illnesses, and so things degenerate until the present time. But as a historian, when I look at the evidence that's available for the past, what happens is it's a strange thing, because for Ayurveda, the oldest treatises that we have are these wonderful, amazing encyclopedias. It's like you go from 0 to 100 miles an hour just in 1 second. From nothing, you suddenly have encyclopedias. So where did they come from, and what is the background of these? And it's difficult to know, but each one of them says that in the treatise themselves, at the end of every adhyaya, they say, for example, in the case of Charaka, it says, this is the work of Charaka, who is this Pratisanskarta. He is the editor, the editor of the work of Agnivesha. And Agnivesha hears this work from his teacher, Atreya Punarvasu. So we have within the texts themselves a story about transmission. There's also the idea that there was a much bigger and more perfect system that somehow got lost, and that what we have now is just some smaller condensed version of that. And that is a story about many shastras and many Puranas and many other pieces of learned literature in Sanskrit. They very often, especially the old ones, present themselves as being just a remnant of something that used to be much bigger and more perfect. And I've thought a lot about this and about the new theories about the origin of writing in India. So I say new, I mean, it's not very new now, but 20 years ago or something, Harry Falk developed a theory that writing was invented by Ashoka for use in his inscriptions. And I think he's right. I think that's probably correct. So if we have writing invented in the 3rd century BC, it's somehow a little strange. This is this period of Indian history that Patrick Olivelle identified as being between the empires, that between the end of the Mauryan Empire and the beginning of the Gupta Empire, we get this huge explosion of Sanskrit literature. You get the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, you get Vyakarana, you get Mahabhashya, you get, at the end of the period, you get the Yoga Sutra Bhashya, and you get Dharma Sutras, Dharma Shastras, you get the Ayurvedic works as well. And, we could name many other. There's a vast creation of material just at the time when writing is appearing in India for the first time. And of course, this is when we get the first early manuscripts as well, the oldest Buddhist scrolls that Professor Solomon was talking about last week. So I don't think these historical changes are unconnected. And I think that the idea of a perfect ancient science is connected with something that happens when you write something down. When you take a learned oral tradition that lives in the minds of people and in their voices, and you commit it to writing, it's possible, and this is just a hypothesis, it's possible that it feels when you're doing that, that something is lost, that the act of writing it down is somehow a limitation. And it's at this period in the 2 or 3 centuries after writing has been invented that we get this big idea that there was something more in the past and that something was lost. Now, I don't know how to prove this, but it's a conjecture anyway. It might explain this sense that there was something better in the past and that it somehow got reduced.
Thank you, Professor. I think Madhav ji had something to say. Madhav ji, over to you.
Okay, it was such a wonderful lecture. Now I have a question. This was a long time ago that I wrote an article based on some peculiar usages in Charaka that are found to agree with Panini's rules, and you don't find any examples anywhere else in Sanskrit.
Yes.
Other regions and other. And so there was some at least mythical connection of Agnivesha with Nagnajit, king of Gandhara, and Panini coming from Shalaturu in Gandhara. So my general question is, first thing, do you find anything more that distinguishes linguistically different samhitas, and also whether in terms of development of Ayurveda, there are regional schools of Ayurveda?
Thank you. I, of course, I know your article and admire it enormously. And you and I even had a conversation once. I think you told me that you wrote it while you were in hospital once. You decided to read some Charaka while you were in the hospital bed. It's a brilliant piece of research that you did there. Really, really something very special. And so thank you very much for your insights on that. I don't know if everybody got that, but Professor Deshpande showed that some ways in which Charaka uses language are extremely Paninian and are not found anywhere else. They're only found in Charaka. I mean, no, I mean, the big answer is no, I don't know. I don't know about regional traditions. One thing seems to be that there seems to be more connection between Charaka's treatise and earlier Buddhist traditions than with Sushruta. And that's odd because after all, Sushruta apparently is from Kashi or near Kashi. So you would think there would be more connection with Magadhan culture. But of course, Gandhara was also very Buddhist. So there are words that, again, you don't find that commonly, like one that comes to mind is Jantaka, which is some kind of sauna. And Charaka talks about that. And it's a word that you find otherwise mostly in Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit texts. You'll find it in Edgerton's dictionary, for example, but it's not much used outside Charaka. And just this last week in Sushruta, we had the word Vallura, which is an odd, not much used word, which seems to mean dried flesh. Shushka Mansa, but it also maybe can mean a copse or a bush, a thicket. So etymology is puzzling and it's not much used. It's a sort of lexical word, but there it is in Sushruta. So there's definitely quite a lot of vocabulary in these texts that's a little bit unique. But in terms of actual geographical localization, not yet. One other thing to say, that what I was saying, that there seem to be sometimes Buddhist language and Buddhist references in Charaka. It seems from the research done by Andrei Klebanov, that is really not the case with Sushruta. And that's especially peculiar since these old manuscripts survived in Nepal, which is, famous for Buddhism, of course. But it seems that Sushruta has less of that Buddhist background than Charaka. But beyond that, and how to localize those things geographically, I don't know.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Madhavji, and thank you, Professor Dominik. I would now request, we'll take one last question. I am unmuting Neeraja ma'am. Ma'am, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I am not a Sanskrit scholar, a very, very basic student of Sanskrit, but I'm a teacher educator. And my question was, I was very fascinated by the Nepal manuscript and the software that you have developed, Professor, to analyze the changes. I'm curious to know if there has been any insight into the causes of these changes. What made people introduce these changes? And
Yes.
what were the consequences of these changes? How did it impact the practice of Ayurveda?
It's a very good question. It's one I think about a lot, because
Thank
the
you.
real work I'm doing at the moment is this really detailed, word by word. Is that a Visarga? This kind of very detailed stuff. So I think about these things a lot. So there are several levels there are at least two levels of change. First of all, the scribes are human beings and they make mistakes. So some things are just writing errors. And, if we do that, if we write something, give it to a friend and they copy it, comes back to us, there would be some changes. Just people do make mistakes and it's very human. So when you are studying these manuscripts, you have to learn the kinds of errors that scribes make, because you'll see a letter and you'll think, but that's not a proper Sanskrit word. Oh, but it's a sha, not a ma. And they must have looked very similar in what he was copying. And so he just made that small mistake or whatever. So you have to learn the kinds of errors that scribes make. Another very common one is, let's say you have a line so the scribe has got an original in front of him and he's copying it. So in the original, let's say a line goes along and it says something karman. And let's say the next line goes along, and at that point, just the next line down, it also by chance has the word karman. And the scribe, when he's copying, his eye skips from the first one to the second one, because it's the same word. He looks down at his paper, he looks up, he looks down, he looks up, and next time he looks up, his eye just goes to that word, which is almost in the same place, but it's one line down. That is the name for that kind of error is a French word, saut du même au même, a skip from one thing to the same thing. So again, that kind of error, you have to be aware. If you find a chunk of text missing, maybe it began and ended with the same word, and it was easy for the scribe's eye to just skip from one part to another. So, and there are many other things like this. So you get to learn how scribes work and what kinds of correction would be reasonable. The second whole level is your great enemy is the clever scribe. What you want is a stupid scribe, a scribe who just copies what he sees. He doesn't know anything. He's got to go on writing, and he can't wait until it's lunchtime and he can go home and have some tiffin with his wife and come back and finish copying. It's just a job. He's just got to write. Because if you have a pundit, a learned Ayurvedic scholar, a pundit who is copying, and you quite often you do, he will have ideas and he will say, this word, it would be better expressed that way, or I could make this clearer if I made a comment. So then he will write a little comment in the margin that will just help the sentence to be a bit more clear, or at least give his interpretation. And then 200 years pass. The next person who copies the manuscript sees this comment in the margin, and he thinks, that's a correction. I must put that in the text. He mistakes that the old pundit's comment, he mistakes it for a scribal error, and he thinks, I must write that in the main text. So then from on, his copy and all the copies that derive from it have got that extra comment in them, and we are seeing that quite a lot in the difference between the Nepalese manuscripts and the printed edition. There are quite a lot of little pieces of text that help the reader to understand it, or give a little bit of an interpretation, or make a difficult compound easier to read. And this is the result of clever scribes or learned pundits who are involved at some point in the history of the text in copying it and improving it as they copied it.
Thank you so much for that exhaustive answer, Professor. There are a lot of other questions. We're creating a document where we'll be taking all these questions and getting answer from Professor once he's free, and we'll be sharing the document with all of you. But as Sangeeta ma'am always says, it's necessary to hear out. I'll read questions quickly, such just that we hear these questions. Sunilji asks, what is the historical overview of the evolution of Ayurveda in the various dynasties ruling across the entire geographical expanse of the subcontinent? And Gautamji asks, is there any correlation between Tridosha and Triguna Sattva, Rajas and Tamas? And there's a question from Vatsalaji, should a Vaidya use European herbs if treating in Europe? Ayurveda seems to suggest working with particular rather than universal. These are the few questions in the box, and a lot of comments and comments of gratitude for that you gave us this beautiful lecture. With this, I will close the discussion session and would request Sangeeta ma'am. Ma'am had something to inform. Ma'am, over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you, Preet. And once again, thanks to everybody for their questions. And each of the questions is very important. It's just that multiple reasons we are not able to take all the questions. They're all very important. And I think the last part of Professor Dominik's presentation and the response which he just gave for the question on understanding the mechanisms the clever scribes use, I think that itself is a very fascinating topic, and maybe we should be requesting another opportunity from Professor Dominik just to perhaps focus on that, and perhaps the last part of his presentation, if we could have more time to discuss that, because that's very important, bringing in technology and even the technological excellence perhaps people had even in older times. Yes. So, but before we conclude, I just wanted to share some of our young scholars' work, because I think it's very important. There is a dialogue and there's a conversation that is happening between the young scholars and, of course, experts. So this is just a few minutes I'm going to steal from all of you and request you just a possibility of listening to these scholars. And why I'm calling out three names is because these three people whom I'm going to call out are working on health traditions, and each of them have taken a very innovative path, and they are traveling not in the center path. So they are definitely taking the marginal space, and they are evolving a lot of concepts which are not very easy. So which are primarily based, at least for two of them, are primarily based on their ethnographic work and their own insights. So it is not just the text which is helping them, but what is helping them is their own mind, which engages with a historic past, which may not have proper names and labels and so on. But let me not talk too much. So first, let me request Sukanya ji. I think maybe I should ask you to tell what you're working first, your thesis title, and then very briefly, inform us what you are doing. Sukanya.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. First of all, thank you, sir, for the wonderful enlightening presentation. Myself, Sukanya ji. Currently, I'm working as a research associate under the guidance of Sangeeta ma'am at NIAS. My area of interest is like health and healing practices of two tribal communities of Kerala. They are less known tribal communities, and both are traditional healers also, both communities are. So my area of research is indigenous healing practices of two tribal communities, which is Adian and Mavilan. And mainly I will be focusing on the ritual healing practices of these communities, along with this herbal medication also. Like that, as you know, the tribal communities have their own concept towards their health, towards their remedies, and whatever, which is always connected with that culture. I will be doing ethnographic research. During my research part, I'm also trying to create an ethnographic profile of these communities, which is life and culture. So, like these tribes have their own cultural and social practices to treat various diseases and ailments, and which is very holistic in nature.
Thank you, Sukanya.
This is so important and very interesting. I wish you very well. I mean, these different kinds of tribal medical traditions.
Yes.
We have some evidence from the work of Van Riede in his Hortus Malabaricus that he was aided by a member of the Erdava tribe, of the Erdava community as well. So they were also traditional healers who were helping at that time. Yes. May I ask, whereabouts are the Adiyan and Madhyan? Which part of Kerala?
Yeah, Adiyansa belongs to Wayanad districts of Kerala.
Oh, yes.
Then Mavilan belong to Kannur and Kasaragod district, but 80% of Mavilans are at Kasaragod district only.
Kasaragod.
Kannur.
Right.
Both are traditional healers in nature. Among Adiyas, there is one famous ritual healing practice you might know, which is called as a Gadiga.
No, I didn't hear about that. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I really look forward to reading in the future results of your research.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wish you all good things.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dominik, for your good wishes for this young scholar. And thank you, Sukanya, for your brief introduction. And Dr. Pushya is an MD in Ayurveda, but she also thought it is important to bring in philosophy and psychology and also go back to the text to understand perhaps certain concepts which are very important to identify in Ayurveda. Dr. Pushya, briefly about your work.
Sure. Thank you, ma'am, and thank you once again, Dr. Dominik, for such a wonderful lecture. So what I'm hoping to look at through my study is to understand how Ayurveda understands this concept of well-being.
Oh, yes.
Particularly in the context of, the self and self-consciousness and what may be called life purpose or meaning in life. Because I think that an Ayurvedic definition of well-being really encompasses all of these things. And even a brief literature review that I have done shows me, for instance, that samadosha, samagnishcha, samadhatu from Sushruta. So this idea of balance and harmony and equilibrium. And also from the Charaka, karyam dhatu samyam ihochyate. Dhatu samya kriyasyokta tantrasyasya prayojanam. So this idea of samya and equilibrium, not only between this, limited mind body, but between a larger, the self, the ecosystem, relationships, so social well-being, ecological well-being, maybe for want of a better word. So all of these seem to be encompassed within this understanding of well-being. So I'm very interested in looking at how that plays out in an Ayurvedic understanding of self and consciousness. So I'm hoping to also have a literary study of this, as well as an interaction with physicians, health seekers, and also traditional practitioners. To get a sense of how these concepts, if at all, translate into a kind of lived practice.
That's wonderful. I can imagine that your work will lead to an important result that will help people to live more wholesomely and a better life.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dominik, and thank you, Dr. Pushya. I see Rakesh Kumar there, and I think he's sitting in the library of our institute from the background. So I don't know whether he has a proper mic system to speak. Can you give me an indication? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So then Rakesh Kumar is another scholar in our institute. Can you briefly talk about your work?
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir, for wonderful lecture. I was attending from YouTube. And so basically, I am working on 4 tribal communities of Kerala, namely Chola Naikans, Cartoon Naikans, Arnadan and Panyas. Among all these 3 are hunter-gatherer tribes, and they does not have a proper tradition of Vaidyas. So knowledge was spread among them as a collective knowledge throughout the community, among male and female of this community. So I'm trying to look at how their knowledge system, because of transition in their lifestyle, subsistence pattern is changing. So how this is affecting the knowledge system, traditional knowledge system of healing per se. And then second point, I'm looking on how this change in climate and other things are affecting their medical knowledge system, because plants and all are extincting because because of climate change. And this
Yes.
natural hazard like flood and all are how this affecting their knowledge system per se. And the third point I'm looking at this how their knowledge system is connecting with this worldview and this basically this historicity of their knowledge system, whether this goes back to this tradition of like before Ayurveda, or this how their Ayurveda and traditional knowledge system are related to each other and all. So these 3 points I'm basically largely looking on this. This is a brief.
Do these communities have any written records? Do they have sort of booklets with recipes in them, or diaries or something like that? Nothing like that. It's not a written culture at all.
Not even not a regional culture, but sir, their knowledge system was not based on nomenclature and all. They just know the contextual knowledge is more important than this names and all other things. So this make this knowledge system very important, because the generation will go, knowledge system will also go along with this, because there is no written record, there is no name itself for this identification. So in that sense, the documentation part is very, very important for this. For my research in that sense.
I may be a little out of date now, but the Foundation for the Revitalization of Local Health Traditions in Bangalore used to do work along these lines, and they developed some experience with documentation of rural health traditions. There was a gentleman called Darshan Shankar, and then after him Gangadharan. These people worked in these kind of projects. I don't know if maybe you are already in touch with them, but it's something also I was thinking of for Sukanya ji as well. But have you contacted them?
Yeah, well, Dr. Gangadharan is our good friend, and he's a co-traveler with us. Is Darshan Shankar, I mean, as having founded FRLHT, it's amazing. And also, I think, I mean, just to, next time you would come visit Bangalore, Professor Dominik, of course, we wish to have you at our institute, but then I would also like to take you to the ethno-medicinal garden, which FRLHT has developed by someone, Ganesh Babu. And his name is not very known, but he quietly works, and he has developed a beautiful ethno-medicinal garden there for years of, work and struggle. So yes, we are.
I'd love to see it. I love botanical gardens. One of my greatest joys. Can you still hear me? Yes, I just pulled my microphone. I remember once years ago at Kottakkal going to see their botanical garden of the Aryaveda Shala and I was given a guided tour by Dr. Indira Balachandran, I think was maybe the name. And she's a very knowledgeable person and a beautiful garden. It's so interesting to see these botanical gardens. I remember when FRLHT got that site out on the outskirts of Bangalore for the first time, and I did go to visit at that time, but it was still somewhat undeveloped. So it must have changed a lot since I've been there.
It changed a lot, and I think I'll get back to you perhaps after the lecture too. But it's wonderful to see and know that you have seen that place before what is there today, and I think a lot of developments at that place. I'll write to you. And
I used to live in Bangalore. I lived there 94 to 95. I lived in down near Talgatapura on the Kanakapura road. So I had my children in school at that time and so on. So I feel very close to Bangalore.
That's so nice to know. And I hope you will be able to again visit Bangalore, and we will have the pleasure of hosting you at our institute. Yes, and the last I would request about another scholar, Meera Menon, to talk about her work. Her work is much more in the marginal, because she works on an area which few people would dare to travel, because it's about perhaps black magic, but maybe not. Meera?
Thank you, ma'am, and good morning, sirs. It was a
good
pleasure
morning.
to listen to you today. And my work is, I would rather start by going with my title of the work. It's slightly long, but anyway. It is The Secret of the Word and the Theatrics of Faith Healing, Tracing the Consciousness Nexus through the Mantravada traditions from Kerala. So I'm not sure if you have heard about Mantravada, but it falls under the shamanistic practice, if I could use an umbrella term. And I did see that you mentioned tantric practices along the health traditions that you have listed. So Mantravada is a little different from tantric practices because it is a very I could say it is only seen in Kerala as such. The very particular way in which it is practiced in Kerala is different from how it is practiced in other parts of India. And I'm looking at ambiguity of language as a function and how that plays across in faith healing, and trying to make some connections with conceptual frameworks and how they affect healing and so forth. So it is definitely an interesting study, and what fascinates me is the fieldwork component of it, because I'm doing an ethnographic work as well. So I get to interact with these people and speak to them, and it is been quite an experience working with them.
And
So,
are they willing to speak with you? They're willing to share some of their practices and ideas?
right. So I think to a certain extent, yes. So if you know how to approach them, it's been a building of rapport kind of a process, which has been long term, but definitely they do open up to you. Although there is a certain secrecy that they're very protective of, they do speak to you about certain things, and there are ways of getting to them, them talk to you, and it happens. Yes.
Another wonderful project. How interesting.
So faith
again,
healing is something that we see a lot in India, and it is difficult to unravel how exactly it happens, but it is a very interesting question to ask, I feel. And
yes. A long time ago, I visited Punkudilmana, where there was some tradition which it presented itself to the outside world as a center for Ayurvedic healing of mental illness. But actually what was happening there, I think maybe had something in common. Nearly everything was going on at the shrine. That was really the devotional presentation, mainly of ladies, to the shrine, and I don't remember who the deity was there, but it was definitely a Hindu deity. But the strange thing was that nearly all of the ladies who came there were Muslim ladies. So there was some unexpected crossovers going on there.
Right. So Punkudilmana is one of the field sites that I have picked for my study as well. So I did visit place a couple of times, and like you said, there are a lot of Muslims who come there and Hindu deities. So there are fascinating things happening there as well.
There's a French anthropologist who's written about Punkudilmana. I can't remember his name right now, but if you're looking, I can't remember if he wrote in English or French, but if there is, a serious study already maybe from 10 years ago by a French anthropologist.
Okay,
I can send that a note about that.
Okay, that'll be great. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Well, good luck with your research. What another great project.
Thank you, Professor Dominik. And I think we will be requesting you to let us know about French anthropologist who worked on Punkudilmana, because that's also one of the major sites for Meera Menon for her work. I think we just wanted to introduce some of our scholars who work on health traditions, because I think it's important to have a conversation, even in the digital space.
Yes. Isn't this fantastic?
These rectangles can speak.
I've got it. It's Tarabu. Gilles Tarabu.
Yeah, I'm familiar with her work, Tarabu, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's an article here, but I don't have the book, but I think there is also a book. I've got a reference to a 1999 article. Anyway, yes, so Tarabu.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I'm familiar with her work, yes.
Yeah, so thank you so much, everybody. And of course, thank you, Professor Dominik, for your lecture, and as well patiently listening to some of our young scholars and their work. And I think this is something which perhaps we should call as part of not just modernity, but part of olden times, where people who have more knowledge or more experience talk with young scholars, and in an equal space is shared. And from there, more insights emerge. And I think that's the philosophy of our program as well. So I think I have spoken a lot today.
Well, it was a privilege. It was a privilege to meet to meet your students, and I'm very excited by all their projects, and I wish them every success. Thank you very much for letting me meet them. It was good for me.
Thank you, Professor Dominik, and thank you, everyone. And at this point, I think my mic need to be snatched by Preet.
No, thank you so much. And I think it is really necessary for establishing this conversation. It is really nice to see a congregation of so many like-minded people working towards healing traditions from so many different perspectives, historical, archaeological, or ethnographic, or Vaidya herself working towards these practices. I would request. I think I went. I stuck for a while.
There was some hiccups, but it's
yeah,
okay.
I would request Niharika ji to talk about the next session, followed by the formal vote of thanks. I would request Meera to be the formal vote of thanks. First, Niharika ji.
Thank you, Preet, and thank you, sir, for such a wonderful lecture. The upcoming lecture is by Professor Divakar Acharya. The lecture is on the method of Neti Neti. It's on 24th March 2021. The timings are 5 p.m. IST and 11:30 a.m. GMT, which is in Oxford time. Over to Meera.
Niharika, and thank you very much, sir, for this very, very interesting lecture. And the intimate detail with which you have approached the subject is nothing short of inspirational. And so we have, on behalf of TSP and all of us here, we extend our deepest gratitude for the lecture that you shared with us today. And I have to thank Dr. Sankita Menon, who is a guide and also an inspiration to all of us, who organizes these kind of platforms so that we get to interact with great scholars like you. So thank you, Sankita ma'am, as well. And I have to also thank Preet Kona, Niharika Sharma, Dr. Pushya, and all these wonderful scholars here who are also part of our team in organizing these lectures so beautifully. So thank you, all of you. And last but not the least, this august audience who are here, such great scholars, Prof. Madhav Deshpande and others. So you can only imagine what privilege it is for all of us to share a platform, which is not possible if it were not on Zoom. So thank you all for being here today, and we look forward to having you in our upcoming lectures as well. So thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.